April 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its violent crescendo. The once proud panzer divisions of the Wehrmacht, those steel phantoms that had roared across Poland, France, and Russia, were now fighting a desperate, losing battle. Yet even as their empire crumbled, many German tank commanders carried one lingering emotion toward their American enemies: fear. But it was not the kind of fear one would expect. They were not afraid of American tanks. They were not afraid of the Sherman's thin armor or its unreliable gun. No, what they feared most was something far more unsettling, something invisible. A weakness, a flaw so deeply embedded in the American war machine that, paradoxically, it made them unstoppable. The mist clung low to the broken trees outside the German town of Kassel. From a ridge overlooking the valley, Oberleutnant Hans Reiter peered through his Zeiss binoculars. Below him, American armor was advancing, an endless column of Shermans grinding forward through the mud. The sound was deafening, tracks clattering, engines growling, the metallic rhythm of an army that refused to stop. Reiter's crew watched in silence. They knew the numbers. They knew the statistics. On paper, their Tiger I could destroy a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. One shell, one hit, one kill. Yet Reiter's palms were sweating. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. He had seen too many engagements that defied logic, too many battles where the Americans should have broken, should have turned and run, and yet they didn't. The first time he encountered the Americans was in Normandy. He still remembered the strange mix of arrogance and chaos that defined them. They lacked the cold precision of the Germans, the discipline drilled into every panzer crewman. Their tanks looked almost comical, boxy and tall, painted in faded olive drab. Their soldiers laughed too much, smoked too much, talked too loudly. To a German officer like Reiter, they seemed unprofessional, children playing war. But as the days turned to weeks, that illusion began to crack. Every time his Tiger emerged from the hedgerows and opened fire, the Americans came back. Not the same men, of course. Fresh replacements. Endless replacements. And that was the first hint of the weakness, the terrifying weakness, that haunted him ever since. At first, it seemed like pure foolishness. The Americans would charge straight into ambushes, even when they knew a Tiger was waiting. They didn't maneuver like the Soviets or coordinate with the same discipline as the British. They just kept coming. When Reiter's crew destroyed one Sherman, another appeared. Then another. Sometimes 3. Sometimes 10. He once counted 16 Shermans burning in a single field, and still, the attack continued. To a German mind trained in efficiency, it was madness. But to the Americans, it was strategy. That night, as the glow of burning tanks lit up the French countryside, Reiter's gunner, Klaus, muttered something he would never forget. "They fight like machines," he said quietly. "But not because they are machines. Because they don't care how many die." It wasn't entirely true, of course. The Americans cared. They cared deeply. But what Klaus was sensing wasn't apathy, it was resilience. An industrial resilience so vast that it distorted the logic of war itself. Every Sherman destroyed was replaced within days. Every lost crew was replaced by another, trained just enough to keep moving forward. It was a terrifying rhythm, one that German officers couldn't comprehend. The Americans had turned weakness into strength. In December 1944, that fear reached its peak in the Ardennes. The snow was falling thick and heavy when Reiter's unit was transferred to support Kampfgruppe Piper during the Battle of the Bulge. Intelligence suggested the Americans were collapsing. The German command believed one last armored thrust could split the Allied front and force them to negotiate. Reiter's Tiger, coated in whitewash camouflage, rumbled through the frozen forest. The mood among the men was strangely hopeful. They believed this counterattack might change everything. But hope evaporated as soon as they reached the first American defensive line. It wasn't the firepower that stopped them, it was the relentlessness. The American Shermans were everywhere. They weren't superior in any technical sense, but they appeared like ghosts, reappearing in positions they shouldn't have been able to reach. The Germans would destroy one platoon, only to be hit by artillery guided by spotter planes minutes later. Then more tanks, dozens, rolling in from unexpected directions. Even when the Germans achieved tactical victories, they were drowned by sheer volume. It was like fighting an ocean with a sword. As Reiter's Tiger advanced towards Stavelot, they encountered a burned-out American column, Shermans gutted, trucks smoking, bodies frozen in the snow. And yet, within hours, the same road was filled again. Fresh units, new faces. He realized then that the Americans were not merely soldiers. They were an extension of something far larger, an industrial organism, cold and tireless. Germany, for all its engineering brilliance, was dying of exhaustion. Factories bombed, fuel gone, men conscripted at 16 and 60. The Americans, by contrast, had abundance. Endless supplies, endless men, endless belief in the inevitability of their victory. That belief was what terrified him most. In a letter Ryder wrote in early 1945, found decades later in an abandoned farmhouse, he described the experience with haunting clarity. "We fight ghosts," he wrote. "Each time we kill them, they return, multiplied. Their machines are weak, their tactics clumsy, their courage uncertain. But something drives them that we cannot destroy." That letter was never sent. It remained folded inside his map case when his Tiger was finally destroyed near Fulda by a swarm of Shermans from the 4th Armored Division. His gunner was killed instantly. Ryder escaped with burns on his hands and face. As he crawled through the wreckage, he saw American tanks rolling past his smoking Tiger. They didn't even stop. No celebration, no hesitation, just movement, forward and forward, like a tide that could never be turned back. That, historians would later note, was the essence of the American weakness, the fragility of their machines, the inexperience of their men, the naivety of their optimism. It should have doomed them. Instead, it became their weapon. The German command never understood how to fight an enemy that refused to behave rationally. They sought perfection, while the Americans embraced imperfection. The Tiger was a masterpiece, but it could only be built in handfuls. The Sherman was a compromise, but it could be built by the tens of thousands. And in total war, quantity has a quality all its own. Ryder never saw the war's end, but his words, found decades later, echo the sentiment of many Panzer veterans who survived. They did not fear American tanks, they feared American persistence, the very weakness that should have broken them. Poor armor, weak guns, untrained crews, had instead made them invincible. In the ruins of Cologne, where the echo of artillery still bounced between shattered cathedrals, Sergeant William Red Mallory leaned out from the turret of his Sherman and scanned the horizon. Smoke drifted lazily across the skyline, the smell of burning oil mixing with wet concrete and death. He was 22 years old, but his eyes looked 40. His crew had been together barely 6 weeks. The loader had been a farmhand from Kansas, the gunner, a steelworker from Detroit, the driver, a kid who lied about his age just to enlist. None of them had expected to survive this long. The Germans called them amateurs. Red didn't care. He wasn't fighting for perfection. He was fighting to go home. Across the river, the sound of a German 88 cracked through the air. The shot slammed into a Sherman 2 blocks away, tearing through the turret like it was made of paper. Flames shot skyward. Red ducked, heart pounding. "That's a Tiger," he muttered. "He's hunting us." The radio crackled, garbled commands, static, the faint panic of men caught in a maze of fire. The Shermans had been ambushed again, pinned by a single German tank that could kill them before they even saw it. And yet, despite the fear, none of them stopped. Orders were simple: push forward, always forward. If one tank fell, another took its place. The logic was brutal, mechanical, efficient in its own strange way. The Tiger's strength lay in its armor, in its gun, but also in its myth. German commanders believed in their invincibility. American soldiers believed in something else entirely, their ability to adapt. When Red's gunner finally spotted the flash of the Tiger's muzzle in the distance, he didn't wait for perfect aim. He fired, then moved instantly. The shell ricocheted harmlessly off the Tiger's frontal armor, but the movement saved their lives. The second shot from the German missed by inches. "He's tracking us," Red yelled. "Keep moving." Their Sherman darted behind the shell of a factory, its engine howling in protest. 2 other Shermans moved up on the flank, not to outgun the Tiger, but to outnumber it. Within minutes, 4 American tanks were circling like wolves around a wounded bear. They fired smoke shells, obscuring the Tiger's vision. Then came a daring maneuver. 1 Sherman charged straight at the German, sacrificing itself to draw fire. The others used the distraction to get close enough to aim at the Tiger's thinner side armor. The hit landed. The mighty beast shuddered, then erupted in smoke and flame. That was the paradox of American weakness. They compensated for lack of power with aggression. They replaced fear with instinct. And while the Germans saw chaos, the Americans saw opportunity. Every destroyed tank was a lesson. Every mistake was a teacher. By 1945, they had turned improvisation into doctrine. They learned to fight not with precision, but with imagination. A kind of battlefield creativity that unnerved their enemies. The Germans wrote manuals. The Americans wrote history in real time. Months later, in a debriefing, a captured German officer described his experience facing these weak opponents. "They do not fight like soldiers," he said bitterly. "They fight like a swarm. You destroy one, another replaces it instantly. You flank them, and they appear behind you. It's as if they have no fear of death." He paused, then added softly, "Perhaps that is their strength." To a man trained in the Prussian tradition, where order and hierarchy defined everything, this chaos was terrifying. German tank warfare was a chess game. American tank warfare was a storm. The contrast extended far beyond the battlefield. In Germany, each Tiger was built by master craftsmen, precision engineered, tested meticulously. It took months. In America, Shermans rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds each week, stamped out like automobiles. The factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh had become extensions of the front lines. Housewives worked the assembly belts, riveting steel plates that would soon become the armor shielding their husbands, sons, and brothers. That collective effort transformed America into something larger than any single army, an engine of war fueled by ordinary lives. The Germans never understood that. They believed war was the domain of warriors. The Americans turned it into a national industry. Even the men inside those machines reflected that spirit. They were not trained from childhood for war. They were mechanics, farmers, teachers. And yet, they adapted faster than anyone expected. The first crews that landed in North Africa in 1942 were inexperienced and terrified. By the time they reached Germany 3 years later, they had evolved into something else entirely, soldiers who understood that victory didn't require perfection, just persistence. That was the weakness, the terrifying weakness, that drove them. They knew they were not the best, but they also knew that didn't matter. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, stories spread among German tankers about the Americans' strange indifference to loss. They spoke of battles where entire armored platoons were annihilated, only for replacements to appear within hours. One Tiger commander near Remagen reportedly said, "They drown us in steel, not because they must, but because they can." That statement, though cynical, carried truth. The American military machine could replace a lost tank faster than Germany could replace a lost man. Every Tiger destroyed was a blow to German morale. Every Sherman lost was merely a number on a clipboard. And yet, for all their efficiency, there was something deeply human about the Americans' approach. When Red Mallory finally reached the outskirts of Frankfurt, he saw a young German boy, no older than 15, dragging a Panzerfaust across the street. The boy's hands were shaking, his uniform too large. Red hesitated. He could have fired. Instead, he let the boy disappear into an alley. "War's already over for him," Red muttered. That small act of mercy, unseen by anyone, captured what separated the Americans from their enemies. They fought hard, but they did not fight with hatred. They fought to end the war, not to prove superiority. To the Germans, that moral detachment was incomprehensible. How could a people so naive, so careless, so materially indulgent, be so unstoppable? In the months after the war, surviving German tank commanders were interviewed by Allied historians. Over and over, the same sentiment emerged: we were better, but they were stronger. When asked what they feared most about facing the Americans, one veteran of the 2nd SS Panzer Division replied, "Their weakness. You cannot break something that refuses to see itself as broken." It was a poetic answer, and perhaps the most accurate. For all the firepower, for all the precision engineering, the Germans could never replicate that spirit. Their strength demanded perfection. The Americans' weakness thrived in imperfection. When the snow began to fall over the H-region forest, the Americans learned again that courage was not measured by strength, but by how long you could endure fear. The forest was death itself, thick, frozen, and filled with German traps that turned every path into a killing ground. Sherman tanks bogged down in the mud, their engines whining helplessly, while Tiger tanks prowled like ghosts among the trees. But the real battle was psychological. German commanders believed that terrain like this would cripple the Americans. It should have. And yet, the attacks kept coming. Day after day, men waded through minefields, crawled through barbed wire, and dragged their tanks forward inch by inch. For every Sherman destroyed, another followed. For every platoon wiped out, fresh reinforcements filled the gap. It was not skill that broke the German lines, it was the sheer refusal to stop. That refusal terrified the men who had once believed themselves unbreakable. One German officer later admitted that facing the Americans was like fighting water. You could push it aside, carve through it, even scatter it with explosives. But it always came back, reshaping itself, swallowing you whole. He said it with bitterness, but also with awe. The Germans fought with precision. The Americans fought with momentum. Once set in motion, they became unstoppable not because of any single tank or general, but because every man believed that stopping meant certain death, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The irony was that the Americans' so-called weakness, their dependency on material abundance, their mechanical inferiority, their lack of elite training, became their greatest psychological weapon. The Germans had built their military on the idea that superiority of will and skill could overcome any numerical disadvantage. For years, that belief had proven true, from Poland to France, to the steppes of Russia. But by 1944, that faith began to crumble. Each time a Tiger platoon rolled out to meet the enemy, they found not fear, but waves of persistence. "They don't maneuver like soldiers," one panzer commander complained. "They crash through like madmen. And when you destroy them, they don't retreat. They multiply." That confusion eroded discipline. And discipline was the one thing the German army could not afford to lose. Behind those Sherman formations, the true weapon was invisible logistics. While German fuel convoys crawled through bombed-out railways, American supply lines flowed endlessly from ports, across rivers, through rebuilt bridges. The same factories that had once made toasters and cars now produced spare tank parts, ammunition belts, field rations, and gasoline drums. A Tiger might need days to repair a damaged gearbox. A Sherman unit could swap an entire engine in hours. "They fight like a business," a German mechanic wrote in his diary. "Every part is replaceable, even the men." It was meant as an insult, but it revealed a grim truth. The Germans fought for honor. The Americans fought for results, and results came. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German counterattack, that difference reached its breaking point. In the Ardennes, German armor punched deep into Allied lines, smashing through American positions with terrifying precision. Entire companies were encircled, annihilated, or forced to surrender. For a moment, it seemed that the old brilliance of Blitzkrieg had returned, but the illusion didn't last. The Americans didn't collapse. They absorbed the shock, regrouped, and counterattacked with mechanical calm. Within days, fuel shortages crippled the German advance. Tigers sat abandoned on frozen roads, their crews scavenging civilian fuel to keep moving. Meanwhile, Shermans kept coming, not because they were invincible, but because they didn't need to be. Every destroyed tank became a landmark for the next wave. The battlefield became a moving machine, slow, clumsy, but inexorable. The German commanders began to see it differently now. It wasn't the machines they feared, it was the mentality behind them. They faced an enemy that seemed to care nothing for perfection or prestige. The Americans' weakness, their supposed lack of tactical discipline, made them unpredictable. They could fight recklessly because they had the numbers, but they also fought creatively because they had the freedom. A Tiger platoon followed doctrine. An American platoon followed instinct. And instinct, multiplied by thousands of men, became chaos. Controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Inside his headquarters, General Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg, studied the after-action reports with growing disbelief. He knew the Americans' armor was inferior, their gunnery less precise, their training far less rigorous. But the numbers didn't lie. Every engagement they survived, they improved. Every setback made them smarter. "We built our machines to last," he reportedly told a staff officer. "They built theirs to adapt." That single sentence captured the essence of why the German war machine was doomed. Perfection cannot evolve, but imperfection learns. By the war's final months, the German tank corps was a shadow of its former self. The few remaining Tigers and Panthers fought desperate battles against endless waves of Shermans and M10 tank destroyers. Fuel was scarce, ammunition scarcer. Some crews abandoned their tanks and fought on foot. Others destroyed their own machines rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The battlefield had turned into a graveyard of steel, Germany's monuments to its own obsession with strength. Among the ruins, the surviving German tankers whispered the same phrase, "Der Tod kam aus dem Westen." Death came from the West, yet there was something almost poetic in how that death arrived. It did not come roaring in perfection, but stumbling in persistence. The Shermans were loud, clumsy, and fragile, but they came with the inevitability of time itself. For every Tiger that destroyed 10, 100 more replaced them, and as those green tanks rolled across the Rhine, the German high command finally understood what they had underestimated. Weakness was not the opposite of strength, it was its evolution. The Americans had turned their flaws into a philosophy. Where the Germans demanded mastery, the Americans embraced the mess of reality and learned faster because of it. As the H region trees burned and the snow turned black with ash. Red Mallory's Sherman limped forward once again. Its paint was scorched, its tracks half broken, its radio silent. He glanced at the sky, where black smoke trailed endlessly eastward, and whispered to his gunner, "Guess we're still here." The gunner just laughed. A raw, exhausted laugh that had nothing left to prove. Around them, the ruins of German armor lay scattered like gravestones. For all their weakness, the Americans were still standing, and in that simple, stubborn fact lay the truth that every German tank commander would remember for the rest of his life: you cannot defeat what refuses to stop moving. By the spring of 1945, the myth of German invincibility was gone. What remained were broken cities, burned-out tanks, and commanders who could no longer comprehend how they had lost to a nation they once mocked for being mechanically rich but militarily soft. The same German officers who had once laughed at American tank designs now sat in silence, watching endless convoys of Shermans rolling eastward. It wasn't fear of destruction that filled them, it was disbelief. The Americans had not won through brilliance. They had won through a kind of relentless pragmatism that the Germans had never understood. Where the Germans obsessed over perfection, the Americans obsessed over production. Where the Germans demanded mastery, the Americans demanded movement. And in a war that punished hesitation, movement always triumphed. Inside captured German headquarters, American officers found notebooks filled with desperate calculations, lists of tanks, ammunition, and fuel. Every line was a countdown to collapse. A German major wrote, "They do not fight like us. They consume war." To him, it was not an insult, it was an explanation. The Americans didn't view war as an art or a contest of wills. They treated it like a problem to be solved, piece by piece, with machinery, manpower, and mathematics. The Sherman was not a weapon, it was a system. And that system, as flawed as it seemed on paper, was the reason entire German divisions vanished in weeks. That realization spread like a virus through the surviving panzer crews. They had spent years mastering their machines, memorizing every function, every weakness, every sound of the engine. They took pride in precision, in discipline, in being the elite. And then they watched as swarms of Shermans, driven by crews barely out of training, overwhelmed them with nothing more than speed and audacity. One German commander admitted, "Our Tigers were kings, but the Shermans were an empire." The empire he spoke of wasn't made of metal. It was made of industry, logistics, and the terrifying truth that modern war belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. In one of the final battles near Cologne, this truth became undeniable. As American columns advanced through the ruined city, a lone German Panther lay in wait among the debris. Its commander, a veteran of Kursk, knew the streets well. He had destroyed tanks from ambush before. When the first Sherman appeared, he fired one perfect shot through the frontal armor. Flames erupted. The crew didn't escape. But before the smoke cleared, two more Shermans appeared, then four, then eight. The Panther struck again, killing another. Then it jammed. The Panther's gun had overheated, its turret gears groaning under the stress. The American tanks didn't stop. They fanned out, encircling the street. Within minutes, shells from every direction pounded the Panther until it was a burning wreck. From a distance, it looked like a lion devoured by ants. For the surviving German soldiers watching, that moment was devastating. It symbolized everything they had refused to believe, that superior machines meant nothing against superior persistence. The Panther had done its job perfectly, but perfection dies quickly in a world that refuses to slow down. The Shermans were not better tanks, they were better instruments of chaos. And war, by 1945, had become a factory of chaos. Every time the Germans built a weapon meant to dominate, the Americans built 10 meant to endure. What terrified the German tank commanders most was not that the Americans were fearless, but that they were indifferent. They did not see death the same way. German soldiers fought for the fatherland, for history, for something eternal. American soldiers fought to finish the job and go home. That difference, small as it seemed, made them dangerous. They didn't romanticize war. They mechanized it. They turned it into a schedule, a supply chain, a calculation. And when emotion was removed from the equation, only efficiency remained. That, to the Germans, was horrifying. Because efficiency cannot be intimidated, the tone of the war itself changed. When a tiger appeared on the horizon in 1942, it brought fear. When one appeared in 1945, it brought determination. The Americans no longer saw the tigers as monsters. They saw them as targets. They had studied them, learned their limits, their blind spots, their vulnerabilities. Every shell that bounced off a tiger was logged, analyzed, and turned into new tactics. Every defeat became a manual for future victories. It was evolution accelerated by desperation. In this sense, the Americans didn't just win battles. They rewrote how battles were fought. In April 1945, as Allied tanks reached the Elbe River, the last of the German panzer divisions tried to regroup. Communications were collapsing, supplies were gone, morale was worse. A German colonel, interviewed decades later, said quietly, "When we saw their columns moving, we didn't think of men, we thought of machines." He paused before adding, "It felt like the world itself had chosen them to replace us." To him, the sight of American armor rolling endlessly eastward was more than defeat, it was evolution in motion. The world had changed, and the old empires of perfection had no place in it anymore. Even the American soldiers, exhausted and scarred, began to realize what they represented. They were not heroes in shining armor. They were part of something larger, an industrial storm that had swept across continents. When one fell, another took his place, not out of glory, but out of necessity. The Sherman, once mocked for its thin armor and weak gun, became the symbol of that unstoppable will. It wasn't the best tank. It was the right tank for the right war. And history, cruel as it is, rewards the right kind of weakness. In the ashes of the Reich, when the shooting finally stopped, the surviving German tank commanders were taken prisoner. Many of them refused to speak. They sat silently in fields surrounded by wreckage, watching endless lines of American vehicles roll past. One of them reportedly whispered, "They built an army the way we build machines." That single sentence carried more weight than any post-war analysis ever could. Because in the end, it wasn't just the Sherman that defeated the tiger, it was the mind that created it. When the guns finally fell silent, what remained was not peace, but reflection. Across the ruins of Europe, German tank commanders found themselves facing a truth they had spent years denying. The Americans had not beaten them with superior strategy, nor with bravery alone. They had beaten them with a kind of relentless efficiency that felt inhuman. It wasn't passion that destroyed the Reich, it was process. The Germans, who had built their armies on pride and precision, were now forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that modern war belonged not to the artist, but to the engineer. In the makeshift prisoner camps scattered across Germany, captured panzer officers sat in silence. They spoke little to one another, their eyes following the endless convoys of American trucks that rumbled past. Even in victory, the Americans never stopped moving. They march like machines, one prisoner murmured. Even when they rest, they prepare. The statement carried both awe and resentment. To these men, who had devoted their lives to mastery of the tank, the war's end was not just a defeat, it was the death of an entire philosophy. The Germans had treated warfare as a form of craftsmanship. Every maneuver, every shot, every repair had meaning. The Americans had treated it like manufacturing. Where the Germans saw artistry, the Americans saw output. That difference was visible everywhere. The German Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, powerful, precise, but temperamental. The Sherman was a compromise, simpler, faster, cheaper. The Tiger was designed to dominate. The Sherman was designed to function. And function, as history proved, was far deadlier. In post-war interrogations, several German officers confessed their admiration, though they struggled to express it. One said, "We built weapons for a perfect army. They built an army for an imperfect world." It was a haunting admission, one that captured the shift in human thinking that the war had forced upon the world. Back in Washington, American generals were already analyzing the lessons of victory. They understood that the Sherman had been outgunned, but they also knew that its very flaws had revealed something deeper. The machine didn't need to be perfect if the system supporting it was. Every tank was a node in a vast network of logistics, supply, and adaptation. The Germans never truly fought the Sherman, they fought American industry itself. Every factory worker, every engineer, every assembly line had played a role. The war had shown that industrial civilization could mobilize itself like a living organism. That realization changed everything about how the next wars would be planned. Meanwhile, in Germany, the surviving tank crews wrestled with guilt and confusion. Many of them had believed to their dying day that they were the best soldiers in the world. They had trained harder, studied more, and endured longer. And yet, they had been defeated by men who were, in their eyes, amateurs. How could discipline lose to improvisation? How could precision lose to persistence? The answer, bitter as it was, lay in the changing nature of warfare itself. The battlefield had become a machine, and those who could not adapt to its pace were doomed to be left behind. One former Tiger commander, interviewed years later, said something that would echo through history: "We fought for control. They fought for momentum, and momentum always wins." He was right. The Americans had mastered the rhythm of modern conflict, the flow of movement, the flexibility of command, the willingness to make mistakes and learn from them instantly. German officers feared mistakes. American officers weaponized them. In that contrast lay the difference between a crumbling empire and a rising one. But beneath that strategic truth was something more human. The American soldier's strength wasn't only in his resources, it was in his perspective. Most GIs didn't fight for ideology. They fought for survival, for comradeship, for the hope of returning home. That made them unpredictable. They weren't bound by a single code or tradition. They adapted because they had to. To the German mind, this made them reckless. In reality, it made them unstoppable. A Tiger crew followed doctrine. A Sherman crew followed instinct. Doctrine can be broken. Instinct cannot. In the aftermath, as Allied intelligence officers studied captured documents, they found hundreds of German reports describing this psychological warfare. "Their morale does not break," one colonel wrote. "They lose men, they lose tanks, but their determination increases. It is not natural." That was perhaps the greatest compliment the Americans could have received. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on discipline, now saw chaos as their enemy, and chaos had an American face. By the time Germany surrendered, even its most loyal officers knew the truth. Their war machine had been too elegant for its own survival. It demanded resources that no longer existed and precision that the collapsing front could not maintain. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced imperfection as their weapon. Their machines broke often, but they were easy to fix. Their soldiers made mistakes, but they learned quickly. It was evolution in real time. And evolution, not excellence, determines who endures. When the surviving commanders were released years later, many of them became historians, writing books that tried to explain the fall of the Panzerwaffe. Most of them blamed fuel shortages, air superiority, or Hitler's interference. But between the lines, a different truth emerged, a quiet recognition that their enemy had understood something they had not: that war is not won by the best, but by the most adaptive. In their own words, they admitted that the Americans had built an army designed to survive reality. That phrase would define the new age of warfare. Decades later, military academies around the world would study those same campaigns. They would teach that victory in modern war requires resilience more than brilliance, systems more than heroes, and mobility more than might. And they would trace that lesson back to the muddy tracks of the Sherman tanks that rolled through Europe in 1944. Machines once dismissed as weak, now remembered as the instruments of a new kind of power. The German commanders had feared an American weakness. In truth, they had witnessed its evolution into strength. That irony, that cruel inversion, would haunt them for the rest of their lives, because they realized, too late, that they had been fighting not an army, but the future. The war was over, but the echoes of it refused to die. In the shattered towns of Germany, among the ruins of factories that had once built the feared Tigers and Panthers, a silence lingered, a silence filled with questions no one wanted to ask. How had the most advanced military machine in Europe fallen to an enemy they considered naive? How had precision engineering been humbled by mass production? The answer, whispered in every officer's mind, was unbearable. The Germans had been outthought, not just outfought. Across the Atlantic, the United States was awakening to its new role, not just as a victor, but as a superpower. American officers returned home not as soldiers of fortune, but as architects of a new doctrine. They had learned that war was not about brilliance, it was about systems. Every tank, every truck, every rifle was part of a living organism that could regenerate faster than it could be destroyed. That philosophy, born in the mud and fire of Europe, would soon evolve into something even greater, the foundation of modern warfare. German tank commanders, now prisoners or exiles, watched this evolution with disbelief. Men who had once commanded the mightiest armored forces on Earth now read American reports on battlefield logistics and doctrine, trying to understand how their enemies' supposed weaknesses had become their strength. One of them, Colonel Friedrich Weiler, wrote in his journal, "They win by refusing to define victory the way we do. They do not fight for perfection, they fight for completion. They accept loss as part of the process." His words revealed a painful realization. that the Germans' pursuit of mastery had blinded them to the power of momentum. In interviews after the war, Allied intelligence officers described something remarkable in those captured commanders. They were not simply defeated, they were disoriented. Many could not reconcile the image of the untrained, resource-heavy American soldier with the unstoppable force they had faced. They lacked discipline, yes, said one German major bitterly, but their chaos had direction. It was organized chaos. To him, that contradiction was the secret of the American success. The Germans had fought a chess match. The Americans had played a storm. That storm did not end with the war. It became the core of a new identity. American military strategy began to evolve from precision to adaptability. The lessons of the Sherman tank, the very symbol of imperfection, were now institutionalized. Designed for replacement, not repair. Trained for flexibility, not formality. Prepare for mistakes, not miracles. These ideas would later dominate conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The Americans had learned that victory belongs not to those who never fail, but to those who recover fastest. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, the once proud panzer officers became relics of a vanished world. Some refused to speak of the war at all. Others lectured at academies, their stories stripped of ideology, told as cautionary tales. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most respected tank commanders, once told a British interviewer, "We built machines for heroes. They built machines for men." That was the difference. It was an admission not of admiration, but of understanding. The age of heroes had ended. The age of systems had begun. For the German public, the humiliation was deeper than defeat. Their tanks had been the symbols of national pride, their steel monsters the embodiment of invincibility. Now, those same tanks lay rusting in fields and forests, reminders of a dream that had consumed itself. The American Sherman, once mocked as inferior, became the new icon of resilience. To the Germans, it was not just a tank, it was a lesson. Power was no longer measured in thickness of armor or caliber of gun, but in the ability to adapt, to rebuild, to continue moving when everything else had stopped. The soldiers who had fought inside those Shermans, many of them barely 20 years old, never saw themselves as symbols of strategy. They were farmers, mechanics, students. But together, they represented something greater, a nation that had industrialized willpower. The American war machine did not rely on genius. It relied on participation. Millions of workers, thousands of engineers, countless small contributions. That collective effort terrified German commanders more than any weapon, because it meant that war itself had changed from an art of command to an act of civilization. In the months following surrender, as the Allied occupation began, a few German officers were invited to observe American military organization firsthand. They watched with quiet astonishment as mechanics repaired tanks not with precision tools, but with improvisation, welding, reusing, reshaping. What horrified the Germans was not the roughness, but the effectiveness. The Americans didn't care if it was perfect. They cared if it worked. They think like engineers, not soldiers, one colonel muttered. But deep down, he knew that this thinking was the reason they had lost. What lingered in the minds of those defeated commanders was something darker, fear of what this new kind of power could become. If an imperfect army could achieve this much destruction, what would happen when it learned perfection on its own terms? The Americans had proven that adaptability could crush mastery, but they had also proven that emotionless efficiency could reshape the world. To the German officers, it was a terrifying glimpse of the future. Wars fought not by warriors, but by systems vast to fail. Years later, as Europe rebuilt itself under American influence, that fear transformed into admiration. Former enemies studied American methods, replicated their doctrines, even adopted their philosophies. NATO itself became an extension of that wartime lesson, the unification of logistics, production, and adaptability. The Tiger had become a legend. The Sherman had become a blueprint, and yet, the ghosts of that battlefield never truly left. Veterans from both sides would gather at memorials, their memories sharpened not by hate, but by reflection. One American tanker, decades later, stood beside his former enemy and said, "Your tank was stronger. Ours just lasted longer." The German nodded quietly and replied, "That's why you won. You didn't build for strength. You built for time." Both men understood what their nations had learned the hard way, that time favors the flexible. In that understanding lies the greatest irony of all. That the German commanders who once mocked American weakness ended up fearing it most, because in the end, the Americans had redefined what strength meant. It was no longer about the might of a single machine, but about the endurance of an idea. An idea that could rebuild faster than it could be destroyed, that could fall and rise again endlessly, that could turn imperfection into inevitability. In the aftermath of the war, the world had changed forever. The landscapes of Europe were littered with the rusting carcasses of tanks, German Tigers, and Panthers lying side by side with American Shermans. But beyond the wreckage, something deeper was taking shape. The philosophies that had guided these machines into battle were now under the microscope. The Germans had believed in superiority of design, in the craftsmanship of perfection. The Americans had believed in scale, simplicity, and adaptability, and history had already decided which philosophy would define the next century. In Washington, the Pentagon's planners began studying not just how they had won, but why. Reports poured in from officers, engineers, and field commanders. They all pointed to the same conclusion: America's greatest weapon wasn't its tanks, planes, or guns. It was its ability to learn faster than its enemy. The German military had treated war as an art form, guided by elite professionals. America had treated it as a science, an experiment constantly adjusted, refined, and expanded. When something failed, they didn't mourn it, they improved it. That mindset terrified the Germans more than any bomb ever could. One American general, reflecting on the war's end, put it simply: they built warriors. We built workers. And the workers won. Too many. That sounded unromantic, almost cold. But it captured the new reality. The romanticism of the battlefield, of lone heroes and brilliant tacticians, was dead. Modern war was about momentum, not mythology. And nowhere was that more evident than in the way American industry had outpaced the Reich's finest machines. The Tiger tank might have been an engineering masterpiece, but it was a logistical disaster. For every Tiger that rolled off a German assembly line, America could field 10 Shermans. For every breakdown the Germans had to repair, America could replace an entire platoon. That ratio wasn't just arithmetic, it was destiny. German engineers, many of whom were later recruited by the Americans, struggled to comprehend how a nation that valued convenience over precision had achieved such devastating efficiency. They would walk through American depots and factories, astonished at the organized chaos. They build like they fight, one German mechanic observed. Not beautifully, but endlessly. What he saw as disorder was actually resilience. If a part didn't fit, the Americans made it fit. If a design was flawed, they changed it overnight. The German obsession with perfection had frozen them. The American comfort with imperfection had freed them. But perhaps the most fascinating transformation wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. The Germans had entered the war believing in superiority, in the natural dominance of skill and order. The Americans had entered believing in opportunity. Every soldier was a potential innovator. Every mistake was a chance to improve. It wasn't arrogance that fueled them, it was audacity. And audacity, the Germans discovered too late, is a far more dangerous force than confidence. On the battlefields of Normandy, that difference had been visible in every engagement. German commanders meticulously calculated every move, every angle, every shot. American commanders improvised. They used smoke where Germans used precision fire. They relied on communication, flexibility, and sheer persistence. Even when they were outnumbered or outgunned, they found ways to adapt, calling in air strikes, shifting formations, or using terrain creatively. It was messy, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective. You could never plan against them, recalled one German major. They did not fight by rules, they fought by rhythm. As the post-war years unfolded, that rhythm began to reshape the global order. American factories that once built tanks now produced cars, planes, and machines that would rebuild the world. The same assembly lines that had churned out the Sherman now manufactured tractors and aircraft engines. The same logistical networks that supplied the front lines now connected continents. The American way of war had evolved into the American way of progress, fast, adaptable, and relentless. Even the Soviet Union, America's new rival, took notice. Their tanks, like the T-54 and T-55, mirrored the Sherman's philosophy: simple, durable, and easy to produce. The lesson had spread like wildfire: complexity loses wars, adaptability wins them. But for the German veterans who had faced the Sherman, the memory of that weakness lingered like a scar. In their memoirs, they often wrote not about fear of the machine, but of what it represented. It wasn't just the physical might of the United States, it was the terrifying realization that the enemy they once mocked had mastered the future. Captain Ernst Barkman, a Panther commander known for his deadly accuracy, confessed in an interview years later, "We thought we were lions, but they were the flood." You can fight a lion. You cannot fight a flood. That metaphor captured the essence of the new warfare. Germany had built lions, majestic, lethal, rare. America had built a flood, vast, unstoppable, unrelenting. And just like a flood, it didn't matter how many times it was repelled. It always came back stronger. The German tank commanders who had once scoffed at American machinery now spoke of it with reverence and dread. The Shermans were never the best tanks, but they were always there. And that constancy, that persistence, was what made them terrifying. When historians later analyzed the conflict, they coined a term for this phenomenon, industrial warfare. But those who lived it knew it by another name, the victory of the ordinary. The Germans had underestimated what ordinary could become when multiplied a million times over. The American soldier, the American worker, the American engineer, they were parts of the same machine. Together, they had created something no commander could defeat, a self-sustaining system that turned even its flaws into advantages. And as the world rebuilt, the echoes of that system spread far beyond the battlefield. In factories, in universities, in the halls of government, the American principle of adaptability became gospel. The Germans had taught the world how to build. The Americans had taught the world how to continue building, no matter what. That philosophy would shape not just the next generation of warfare, but the next generation of civilization. By the early 1950s, the fear that once lived in German tank commanders had transformed into fascination and, in some cases, respect. Many of them, now serving as advisors or engineers under American or Allied oversight, were stunned to see their former enemy not only mastering technology but redefining it. The same country that had once produced crude, boxy tanks was now pioneering jet aircraft, atomic energy, and early computers. It was as if the weakness that German soldiers mocked on the battlefield had evolved into a new kind of strength, one rooted in innovation rather than intimidation. The psychological shift was immense. For decades, Europe had believed that greatness came from discipline and order. The Americans had proven that greatness could also come from chaos and curiosity. While German engineers had asked, "How can we perfect this?" American engineers were asking, "What if we tried something different?" That question, simple, almost naive, became the foundation of post-war progress. One of the best examples was the American approach to tank development after the war. The U.S. Army studied the brutal lessons of Normandy and the Ardennes, where the Sherman's flaws had cost countless lives. But instead of abandoning the concept, they adapted it. The result was the M26 Pershing, a tank born from the realization that flexibility, not perfection, was the ultimate strength. It combined firepower, mobility, and practicality, everything the Sherman had taught America through its limitations. And though the Pershing arrived late in the war, it symbolized a new era. America no longer copied its enemies, it surpassed them. Meanwhile, in Germany, the ghosts of the Tiger still loomed large. The mighty tank that once inspired awe now represented overconfidence. Many former Wehrmacht officers privately admitted that the Tiger had been their downfall. It consumed resources, time, and manpower that Germany could no longer afford. "We built gods," one engineer said, "when what we needed were soldiers." The Americans, he noted, had built soldiers in metal form, simple, reliable, and unrelenting. That humility, strange as it sounded, had become their ultimate weapon. In one post-war interview, a German colonel reflected on what terrified him most about the Americans: they didn't seem to care when they lost. Every time we destroyed a Sherman, 5 more appeared. Every time we took a hill, they came back. It was like fighting a storm that refused to end. He paused, then added quietly, "We were trained to fear mistakes. They were trained to learn from them. That is why they won." Across the Atlantic, American strategists were also learning something profound about their own success. It wasn't just industry or numbers, it was mindset. During the war, American commanders often ignored rigid doctrine in favor of experimentation. Junior officers were encouraged to improvise. Soldiers were allowed to question orders if they found a better way. It was chaotic, yes, but it worked. That culture of decentralized decision-making became the hallmark of American power in the 20th century. From the beaches of Normandy to the factories of Detroit, innovation had replaced hierarchy as the driving force of victory. This same mentality bled into every aspect of post-war life. The can-do spirit that fueled the Sherman factories soon powered Silicon Valley, NASA, and the aviation industry. When America decided to put a man on the moon, The engineers who led the project weren't aristocrats or scholars. They were the children of factory workers, veterans, and dreamers. The same kind of people who once welded Sherman armor plates were now building spacecraft. It was industrial democracy at its finest, the belief that anyone, anywhere, could contribute something meaningful. Yet, beneath this triumph, a quiet irony lingered. The very Germans who once ridiculed America's mechanical simplicity now found themselves studying it. NATO, formed in 1949, relied heavily on American military doctrine. West German officers were retrained in the American way of war, mobility, logistics, and adaptability. The Bundeswehr, Germany's new army, was built not on perfection but on practicality. Even the iconic Leopard 1 tank, developed in the 1960s, embodied lessons learned from the Sherman: fewer breakdowns, faster repair, greater reliability. It was, in many ways, Germany's belated acceptance of the philosophy they had once feared. But the story doesn't end there. As the Cold War began, the world entered a new kind of arms race, one not defined by armor and steel, but by information and technology. And once again, America's so-called weakness became its advantage. The same improvisational mindset that had powered wartime production now drove innovation in computing, aviation, and nuclear research. The Germans, disciplined and methodical, excelled in precision engineering, but America excelled in transformation. They could turn yesterday's ideas into tomorrow's breakthroughs faster than anyone else. In the 1960s, when historians interviewed surviving German tank commanders, they often asked the same question: what was the moment you realized you could not win? The answers varied, but one in particular stood out. A veteran of the Battle of Falaise replied, "It was when I saw a Sherman towing another Sherman that had been hit, and behind them, another Sherman covering them with fire. They moved like ants. When one fell, the others kept going. That was when I knew we were finished." Those words captured something profound about the American character, a refusal to stop. The Germans had sought invincibility through strength. The Americans found it through persistence. Even their tanks seemed to embody that spirit: underpowered, thinly armored, yet unstoppable. The enemy could destroy a machine, but not the system that created it. By the time the Cold War reached its height, this philosophy had reshaped the planet. American tanks rolled through Europe not as conquerors but as guardians. The sight of an M48 Patton or an M60 in West Germany was no longer a threat, it was a symbol of endurance. To the Germans who remembered 1944, it was a haunting echo of a lesson learned in blood, that power is not about perfection. It's about the ability to endure imperfection and still move forward. And so, decades after the war ended, the phrase American weakness had taken on an entirely new meaning. It was no longer an insult, it was a paradox. What the Germans had once seen as fragility was, in truth, flexibility. What they had mocked as disorder was, in fact, genius in motion. The Americans had turned every flaw into fuel, every failure into momentum. That, more than any weapon or strategy, was what terrified their enemies, and continues to define them to this day. The Cold War was not fought with tanks roaring through muddy fields or bombers screaming across the sky. It was a war of ideas, a struggle between two visions of power. On one side stood the Soviet Union, disciplined, centralized, and built upon the same rigid doctrines that once defined the German war machine. On the other stood the United States, messy, unpredictable, decentralized, and endlessly inventive. The Soviets built monuments to control. The Americans built laboratories for innovation. And though their methods differed, both were haunted by the ghosts of the Second World War. For the Germans who found themselves within NATO, the irony was impossible to ignore. Their new allies, the very soldiers they had once fought against, were now teaching them how to think, fight, and even build. American military advisors spoke of flexibility, not rigidity, of creativity, not blind obedience. In training camps across West Germany, the doctrines of Patton and Eisenhower replaced those of Guderian and Rommel. The lessons of the Sherman lived on, not as a tank, but as a philosophy. Adapt or die. One American colonel told his German counterparts, "Because your enemy will not wait for you to be perfect." To many former Wehrmacht officers, it was a strange kind of poetry. During the war, they had mocked the Americans for their lack of precision. Now they were being told that precision alone was not enough. It was mobility, logistics, and resilience that won wars. The Americans had proven it across thousands of miles of battlefield, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the snows of the Ardennes. Their weakness had been their disguise, their chaos their camouflage. Where the Germans had built machines of fear, the Americans had built a machine of survival. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet commanders studied the same battles through an entirely different lens. To them, the lesson of the Sherman was not flexibility, but quantity. They believed victory came through overwhelming mass, the ability to flood the battlefield with armor until the enemy drowned in steel. It was an interpretation both brilliant and dangerous, for it missed the soul of what made America's approach work. The Soviets could copy the numbers, but not the mindset. They could produce tanks by the thousands, but not the culture of innovation that kept those tanks evolving. And that difference, the gap between imitation and imagination, would define the next 50 years. By the 1970s, American engineers were designing tanks that embodied every lesson learned from both friends and foes. The M60 Patton gave way to the M1 Abrams, a marvel of engineering that fused technology, adaptability, and raw power into one unstoppable force. It was fast, lethal, and shockingly efficient. Yet behind its sleek armor and turbine engine lay something intangible, the philosophy born on the battlefields of 1944. Every bolt, every circuit, every design choice whispered the same message. Never underestimate the power of imperfection refined through persistence. When the M1 first rolled across the training grounds of West Germany, older veterans stood in awe. One, a former German officer now serving in NATO, reportedly said, "If we had fought with machines like these, the world would look very different." But another smiled grimly and replied, "No, we would have lost even faster, because we would never have built it. It's too bold, too experimental, too free," and that, perhaps, was the ultimate truth. Only a nation unafraid to fail could create something capable of lasting success. The Cold War was full of such ironies. The Americans, once derided for their chaotic battle plans, became the masters of strategy. Their decentralized command structure, born from necessity in the jungles of the Pacific and the fields of France, became the envy of the world. While the Soviets required orders from above, American units thrived on initiative. A lieutenant could make decisions that changed the course of an entire operation. It was the battlefield version of democracy, messy, but effective. Even in culture, the same spirit echoed. Hollywood war films, veterans' memoirs, and television documentaries all celebrated not just the triumphs, but the struggles, the near defeats that forged victory. The American audience didn't want perfection. They wanted perseverance. They saw themselves in the soldiers who made mistakes, who doubted, who feared, and still fought. In contrast, Soviet propaganda glorified flawless heroes and infallible leaders, but the world could feel the difference. One was myth, the other was human. The Germans watched this transformation with mixed emotions. They saw in America what they had once tried and failed, to become the superpower not just of might, but of imagination. Where their engineers had sought control, the Americans sought discovery. Where their generals demanded obedience, the Americans rewarded audacity. It was a reversal of history so complete that even those who had fought against the United States found themselves drawn to its methods. The enemy had become the teacher. In the end, the weakness that once terrified German commanders was never truly about tanks or tactics. It was about the nature of power itself. The Americans had shown that vulnerability could be strength, that imperfection could be beauty, and that chaos could be order in disguise. They had taken the lessons of war, each failure, each setback, and turned them into fuel for progress. That was their secret weapon, invisible yet unstoppable. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it wasn't the roar of tanks that brought it down, it was the weight of ideas. The same restless, questioning energy that had once driven Sherman crews through Europe now powered a global revolution. The free world had triumphed not by being flawless, but by refusing to stop evolving. And in that moment, somewhere in the shadows of history, the echoes of those terrified German commanders seemed to whisper once more, not in fear, but in awe. History rarely grants clarity while it's being lived. On the battlefield, every moment is chaos, noise, and dust. Only decades later, when the smoke has cleared, do we begin to see what it all meant. For the German tank commanders who once laughed at the clumsy Shermans and the reckless Americans behind them, time became a ruthless teacher. Their enemy's weakness had not been a flaw, it had been the seed of evolution. And when those same commanders, now old men, watched their grandchildren grow up in a world shaped by American innovation and protection, they could not deny it. The world had been rebuilt by the very spirit they once underestimated. The haunting memories of war never truly faded. Many of those veterans, interviewed in documentaries years later, spoke not of hatred but of bewilderment. They remembered the American tanks that caught fire too easily, the soldiers who charged boldly, the mistakes that seemed endless, and yet somehow always led to victory. We thought they were fools, one said softly. But fools do not win wars. They do not rebuild the world. What terrified them was not American firepower, it was American unpredictability. A system that should have failed but somehow didn't. An army that broke every rule and still prevailed. That unpredictability became the foundation of a new kind of empire, one not forged through conquest, but through culture, technology, and imagination. America's tanks became symbols not of dominance, but of determination. Its aircraft represented freedom. Its soldiers became storytellers, bringing home tales of hardship and heroism that would inspire generations. The same chaos that had once filled the muddy roads of Normandy now filled the laboratories of Silicon Valley, the control rooms of NASA, and the classrooms of young dreamers across the world. What had once been a weakness of design had become a philosophy of progress. For those who study war, the lesson is timeless. Perfection breeds stagnation. Flexibility breeds survival. The German war machine of 1944 was a marvel of engineering, beautiful, deadly, and doomed. It could not bend, and so it broke. The American machine, flawed and improvised, stumbled through its early battles and somehow emerged stronger every time. That is why the Tiger became a relic, and the Sherman became a legend. One was feared, the other was remembered, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Fear fades, respect endures. The German tank commanders who once trembled at the endless tide of Shermans eventually came to see that what truly terrified them wasn't American steel. It was the spirit behind it, the refusal to surrender, the capacity to learn faster than the enemy could adapt, the courage to turn mistakes into strategy. In war, that kind of adaptability is more dangerous than any weapon. In peace, it becomes unstoppable. Decades later, as the last veterans passed into history, a few of them left behind letters, small confessions to a world that had moved on. One, written in a trembling hand, read, "We had the better tanks. They had the better men. We fought for control. They fought for possibility. That is why they won." It was not written with bitterness, but with admiration, the kind born from understanding to late. Today, when modern soldiers climb into an M1 Abrams or a Leopard 2, they inherit more than armor and firepower. They inherit a philosophy born in the crucible of failure and refined through perseverance. Every machine carries the DNA of those lessons, the belief that true strength lies not in never falling, but in rising after every fall. And as long as that idea survives, the world will remember why even the most feared commanders once trembled at the sight of American weakness, because weakness, in its truest form, is not the absence of strength. It is the beginning of it. It is the spark that forces growth, the flaw that fuels invention, the crack through which light escapes. The Americans never hid their imperfections. They wielded them. They made chaos their ally and failure their teacher. And in doing so, they built not just tanks or armies, but a nation defined by resilience. The roar of the Tiger may have once shaken the earth, but it is the hum of innovation that still echoes today. In every jet that soars, in every rover that explores distant worlds, in every invention born from trial and error, lives the same defiant spirit that once rolled across the fields of Europe. The spirit that frightened its enemies not because it was flawless, but because it refused to stop trying. And so the story comes full circle. The German commanders who once stared across burning fields at advancing Shermans could not have known that they were witnessing more than a battle. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with rigidity, but with relentless adaptation. The tanks may be silent now, the fields long reclaimed by grass, but the echo remains. It whispers a single, timeless truth across the decades. What terrifies the powerful most is not their enemy's strength, but their refusal to break.